What if one of the most important skills we could ever teach a child isn't confidence, achievement, or even resilience? What if it's how to respond when life doesn't go our way?
Because every child will experience disappointment. Every child will make mistakes. Every child will have moments when they doubt themselves or feel they're not good enough. The question is, what happens next?
This week, we're joined by Wendy O'Leary, educator, mindfulness and self-compassion teacher, author and co-author of Growing Self-Compassionate Children. For many years, Wendy has been helping children, parents and educators discover how self-compassion can transform the way we respond to life's inevitable challenges.
In this first part of our conversation, we explore what self-compassion really is, why children need it from the earliest years, and why it may be one of the most important protective factors we can offer them.
We also discuss the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem.
It's based on achievement, looking a certain way, doing a certain thing, all the different ways that our self-esteem gets bolstered.
Why so many children are hard on themselves.
That part of being happy is being able to handle the hard stuff.
And how parents can begin introducing these skills at home.
And perhaps the most important question is this: if your child is listening to themselves for the rest of their life, what kind of voice do you hope they'll hear?
Welcome to Raising Kind Minds.
Because your voice today becomes their voice tomorrow.
Wendy O'Leary, welcome to Raising Kind Minds.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and the invitation to join you today. It's lovely to spend some time with you.
Wendy, your work is grounded in years of home life, classroom life, lots of real life experience. So before we get into all the research and the skills and tools, can you start by painting us a picture of what you noticed? You know, what made you think, our children really need self-compassion?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think for me, it was really a combination of things that made me start to feel like, okay, this is really the direction that I want to move in terms of how I support children and families. And so a big piece of it was really seeing, before my book, It's Okay, came out, seeing that children were really struggling. And I teach mindfulness and I teach self-compassion. But one of the things that I noticed was that there also wasn't a book geared towards really younger children that integrated that self-compassion component. In particular, the self-compassion break is integrated into the book, It's Okay. So how could I turn those tools, which I knew were so beneficial for adults, for myself personally, for the adults I worked with, and tailor them, right? Make them accessible to the youngest children, because certainly, we probably all know from our own experience that it's taken years of being hard on ourselves and not being kind to ourselves in difficult moments, right? Those are habits that got formed over years and years. If we could unravel that sooner, if we could give children those tools earlier, the benefit, from my perspective, is just enormous, right? Like the potential of supporting children before we get that far along, before it becomes so habitual, I thought was a really powerful thing. And I was seeing in the classroom, I'm going into classrooms, I'm talking to parents, I'm working with parents and working with teachers doing professional development. And the feedback I'm getting from all of those places is that the children were really hard on themselves. And so it was really important to me to make sure that not only was I giving them the skills and tools generically around mindfulness, but to also support them with self-compassion. what are the ways that we can really be kind and gentle and caring towards ourselves, just like we would be to a friend, right? In those moments when things were hard. From the parent perspective, this might be more than you're looking for, but from the parent perspective, one of the things that I think is really interesting is my work with parents. A lot of what they talk about is we want our children to be happy, right? We want our children to be happy, but what we aren't paying attention to is that part of being happy is being able to handle the hard stuff, giving them the tools to ride those inevitable waves of life, right? Like the quote from Jon Kabat-Zinn, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn how to surf. And for me, in my own practice, in my own life, self-compassion has been one of the most essential ways for riding those waves. So I felt it was really crucial to give those tools to children.
100% agree. And you talked about the little ones. What ages are we talking, that you noticed and you got feedback from the parents that their children were beating up on themselves, saying mean stuff to themselves? Either you could see it inwardly or you could hear it outwardly. What age group are we talking about?
Yeah, I'm in preschools. So you're seeing it, you're seeing it that young. And you see the low frustration tolerance in even younger ones. And when they can't do something, they get that frustration, and then they, are acting out from that place of frustration. And we want to cultivate that capacity to kind of soothe inwardly, right? So how do we support that? So yeah, right from the youngest ages. So I do work, quite a bit of work right now at the preschool level and early education, early elementary age. But I think even in those little ones, we can start to do that because they're getting also their messages from us, the adults. So even when I work with teachers who have the littlest ones, the infants, I even talk to them about, right, you can still hold them and say, oh, it's okay. Of course you're feeling sad right now, right? We want to start giving them those messages really young. Their nervous systems are taking that in. So we want to really support that. And of course, that modeling and that mirroring of nervous systems is really important there.
Oh, absolutely. And what we're talking about here is prevention, really, isn't it? It's creating a preventative approach so that when they do hit those pre-teens and teen years, that they've got this in their nervous system, they've got this in their cellular memory, they've got this in their awareness. So for those parents that might not fully understand the complexities of self-compassion, and self-compassion can mean lots of different things, and certainly when I talk to a lot of people, they say, self-compassion, what's that? There's not clarity around this. Some parents I know and educators may hear it as this sort of, it's a bit soft. They think it simply means being soft on yourself, letting yourself off the hook. Can you help everyone listening to define it in a way that would really resonate with parents so that they understand the depth and the importance of self-compassion, and that it's actually quite the contrary to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think just to back up for a second, I think I would say yes, in terms of like the preventative piece that you mentioned. My background actually is in prevention health education. So yes, there's that preventative piece, but I also think it's an early intervention piece because even at that young age, they are already cultivating those habits and those ways of perceiving themselves and those ways of talking to themselves. So I think it's, I think it really comes to the forefront. We see it in the preteens, right? Because there's more acting out around it. But in those earlier ages, it's still really a crucial component of both prevention and that sort of early intervention. In terms of sort of explaining what self-compassion is, I often do share sort of the traditional way it's defined, which is used in the research by Kristen Neff and Chris Germer in the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which of course you're both familiar with. And so I'll talk about how it has these three aspects. And the first is mindfulness. We need to see clearly that there's suffering happening, right? So if we're not looking at something, we can't do anything about it, right? So if there's some avoidance or if we're sort of papering over it, we need to be able to really see that clearly first and foremost. Oh, this is hard, right? So that first piece of mindfulness, and that was really my doorway personally in, because I taught mindfulness for many years before I kind of became exposed to the self-compassion teachings. The second piece, which for me was sort of the aha piece, is this common humanity. And I think that's the piece that many people are not sort of as aware of. And that common humanity really, I think, helps us from kind of slipping into sort of it being that soft, self-indulgent kind of framework, right? So this common humanity is everyone makes a mistake sometimes. Everyone has a hard time sometimes. Everyone, has things not go the way they want sometimes, right? This is just a part of life for everyone. The details of it might be different, but everybody feels bad about themselves sometimes, has self-doubt, right? Is critical of themselves. We want to really kind of find that capacity to understand that common humanity piece. And that keeps us from being like, oh, poor me, only me. But it can be oh, this is hard for me, right? There's that kind of gray area. And I think that's a really essential component. And then the last piece is the self-kindness, which is the piece that I think people misconstrue. They think it's just about that self-kindness piece. But that self-kindness might be the hand on the heart, saying, oh, what do you need? And this is where, for me, also that strength-based kind of approach comes in. So I often will talk to children about being your own sort of best coach, right? How do you say, this is hard and I can do this? All right, honey, you can do this, right? So it isn't about self-indulgence so much as it's about what is actually in our best self-interest, because self-indulgence isn't actually in our best interest. It isn't onward leading to our happiness, our well-being, our growth. So it's a really important component. And the reminder that we are being kind to ourselves with self-compassion simply because we're suffering. And in fact, when we see that clearly, like say we made a mistake, I think this is a great sort of framework. For me, it was really a helpful way to think about it. Say we make a mistake. If I don't have self-compassion in my back pocket, right? I think of it as my greatest strength, in fact. If I'm doing something really hard and I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake, I might not do it, right? Because I might make a mistake. Or if I do make a mistake, I may either blame someone else or not learn from it because I'm not willing, right? Because if my whole self-esteem is contingent on not making that mistake, then it's a really hard thing to do, to really look at the mistake clearly and learn from it. But if I can say, oh, everyone makes a mistake. Yeah, you messed up there. You probably should have handled this that way. So it's not about being like, oh yeah, you made a mistake. That's fine. Don't learn from it. I think in fact, and we know that people do learn more from their mistakes, right? When they can see them clearly. So this allows us to see it more clearly because our entire sense of self isn't contingent upon never making a mistake. So I think it's a really important piece for us to be adding into our toolbox. I always say I never would have written any books if I didn't have self-compassion. I never would have done this because, right? I was like, oh, what am I doing? Right? Like it was new to me. I was going out of my comfort zone, but that's where our growth is. Self-compassion kind of helps us increase that space, right? It gives us a little more space in that sense of capacity of what we can handle. And we can ride bigger waves with self-compassion. So it's a really important tool. The last thing I would say, in the easy version of what is self-compassion, it's being a good friend to yourself. So your good friend might not say, go have a half gallon of ice cream because you're feeling sad, right? Your good friend is going to say, wow, that sounds really hard. Can I give you a hug? Right? Do you need a hug? Should we have a cup of tea? Maybe we'll, do you want to go out for a walk? A good friend, or might say, you know what? Yeah, that's really hard. And you know what? You can do that. What might help, right? Can I help, right? Asking for support and help. So self-compassion, that being a good friend is, I think, also a really lovely framework. And then the last piece that I would share about self-compassion, which we share in our book, Growing Self-Compassionate Children, it was for me the first time that I felt self-compassion, but it really started by coming from someone else. So for some of us, accessing self-compassion can be very challenging initially. And so for me, I share in the book the story of when I was going through a really difficult time. And one of my dearest friends lived in another country. And our time zone issue made it really tricky for us to chat. But she sent me this message on email. It was pre-Zoom. She sent me this message on email and said, I want you to imagine that my love for you is like a warm, cozy blanket. And I want you to wrap yourself in that blanket and soak in my love, feel my love for you. And of course, there was no blanket and she wasn't there in that moment, but I could feel that. And I started to cultivate that as something I could offer to myself. Oh, you know what? It could be my love for me. I could do that too, right? So I started to offer that. So I think the piece that Louise and I really talked a lot about when we were writing Growing Self-Compassionate Children was making sure not to forget about that embodied component of it, that felt sense of self-compassion. And I would say it's life-changing. When you say, why should parents care? Because your children are going to have difficulties, no matter what you do to try and maneuver around that. And if you can give them a skill that helps them be able to have more capacity with those difficulties, that could be life-changing. That helps them be able to try challenging things, to do those things that feel scary, right? What a difference that can make. And to be kind to themselves when things don't go their way, because as we know, life doesn't always go our way. So I think there is no skill that we could give children, quite honestly, that is more important than helping them to cultivate self-compassion.
That is such a brilliant answer. Really appreciate the depth in which you've explored all of that. Capacity, I think it's so vital to, to open the door to a child's awareness and to parents to say, actually, this is hard. Of course it's hard. You've never done this before. And shall we give it a go? That's so empowering, isn't it? And that's not just for when we're little. That's for when we're, I am using those skills. I am absolutely reminding myself. I think I've got a sticky notelet somewhere on this wall, reminding me this is hard and it's because it's new to me. Let's take it gently, one step at a time.
Self-compassion and self-esteem, Wendy. this feels really, really important, because many parents have been told or have brought up their children telling them that they're brilliant, they're excellent, they're amazing, you can do this. And that's always the goal, the self-esteem. So can you explain to our listeners, what's the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem? And then describe what happens, what changes when we shift the focus from self-esteem to self-compassion.
Yeah. So I think that's such an important question. And so when you think about self-esteem, it's contingent, right? It is dependent on something. Us being better than, the best at, right? It's based on achievement, looking a certain way, doing a certain thing, all the different ways that our self-esteem gets bolstered. And all of those are contingent. And I would also say often competitive, right? There's a lot of not as good as or better than, right? High self-esteem, better than; low self-esteem, not as good as. Whereas self-compassion, as we talked about before, is dependent on common humanity, right? How lovely to cultivate a tool and skill that is based on the common humanity that all humans struggle sometimes. And all humans, children and adults, deserve kindness when they're struggling. Like that to me is this baseline sort of shift of modality, right? This just shift of looking at things from this very different perspective. And then the concrete, a more practical way of looking at it. So I was once talking with a colleague who was telling me about their child who was playing. I feel like stories are a good way to kind of explain concepts. So he was telling me about his child who was playing soccer, and he got off the field and he was feeling bad. He didn't play that well that day. And he said, oh, I'm not as good as my friend so-and-so. And he said, and I said to him, no, you're really good. You're good. And I said, oh, and he said, I didn't really know what to say. He said, so again, that you're good. You're just as good. Well, maybe you had an off day, but you're just as good as they are. And you're always, whatever the ways that we try to build them up, you're just as someone else. And telling often, particularly with parents and their children, right? There's some of that happens because we hate to see them struggling. It makes sense. So we don't want to beat ourselves up over this either. And I said to him, I wonder what would have happened if you said, because I said to him, at first I said to him, is he as good as the friend? And he's like, oh no, absolutely not. And I said, do you think he realizes that? So here you're saying something. Children are intelligent. They know. They also know when the parent isn't telling the truth, but they also know if they're not as good. So that was the first piece. But then I said, I wonder what would have happened if you said, oh, it must be really hard to feel like you're not as good as your friend, right? Just acknowledging that it doesn't feel good. And right, we can't all be the best at everything. And so, and that was my information to him, right? So just for you to remember, it's not about us trying to make our children all the best at every single thing. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. But if we're trying to make them feel better, really, we're invalidating their feeling in that moment. His feeling was he was feeling crummy because he didn't feel as good as someone else. And that doesn't feel good for any of us. So can we just kindly and gently acknowledge that and model, it must be really hard to not feel as good as, I bet when they're ready, right, then you can use that 3 pieces of the self-compassion, right? That's the mindfulness. Doesn't feel good. I bet everybody doesn't feel good at some things, right? Because we all struggle at some things. I bet other people don't feel good, maybe even at soccer or at other things. I wonder what might help. I'm wondering, if they can't come up with something in our book, we suggest so you can also say, would you like a hug? Would a hug help? Would going outside and playing help? Like giving them something to do to be kind to themselves. How do you want to take good care of yourself in this moment? Do you want to just go color? Right? So giving them that, but to be able to start first and foremost, letting them land where they are with the feeling. Really, really important, because with self-esteem, often we're bolstering them around something that they know, like it isn't even bolstering their self-esteem. We're trying, but it isn't even doing that because they know when they're not as good at something, or when they've made a mistake, or all those other things. So I think it's a really, really important distinction for parents. But the other piece that I often will, because I think it's so important to also talk about the parent piece of this, not just the child piece. So the child piece is that the self-compassion tool is really beneficial, and to be really, for the parent, really kind and gentle with themselves, because of course you want to make your child feel better, right? It makes sense that you want to make your child feel better. And we have this habit of trying to bolster them. The more we can be kind and gentle with ourselves about it and see it clearly, the more we'll be able to kind of loosen up with that and start to shift, because shifting some of those habitual ways of responding to our kids can be a challenge. So we want to really go gently there with ourselves, and just start to notice when we're doing that, leaning in and trying to fix or trying to bolster self-esteem in your example, right? What are the different ways that we relate to our child when they're suffering? And, maybe can we see if there are other ways that we can sort of support our children in those moments and start to cultivate some of those skills around self-compassion, both for ourselves and for the children.
Wow. Thank you so much, Wendy. I really love that. I got this picture when you were speaking of the self-compassion practice offering almost a level playing field. So we're not competing against our friends. We're, don't even have to compete against ourselves, but the child or the parent, actually. And that I really like what you said about, I'd never really thought about self-esteem in that way, because I would have to either be better than or worse than somebody else. It's a really good distinction. Thank you for bringing that. I'm thinking about all these parents that are listening out there, all grandparents. We have quite a lot of grandparents who are committed to showing their grandchildren a different way, a more compassionate way. And I really love when you said for the parent to go gently on themselves as well, because they've probably been supporting their child in the way that you described. Oh, you're great. You can do it. Maybe you're just having an off day. Next time you can get in there. Because that's what we have. That's probably what we received when we were growing up. I certainly wasn't aware of self-compassion. Certainly not receiving it. Not saying that my parents weren't kind or were encouraging. So it might be a bit uncomfortable for a parent to try and start to embody these self-compassion practices with their child. And they may be a bit clunky and do it a bit clumsily. I mean, I know you've just taken us through quite a gentle way, inviting the child to see where they're landing, how they're feeling, acknowledging that before saying, well, what is it you need right now? Would you like to go outside and play or do some colouring in? Is that what you would suggest for a parent who just sees their child struggling? I mean, they may really be really bad at soccer, but what would you suggest, or what would you suggest if you see to the parent listening, where could they start, especially if they don't know self-compassion? They're just a baby beginner,
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think most of us weren't raised with this, at least in my experience in going out teaching to all the people I've, exposed to these teachings. They're like, this is new. So I think first and foremost, being really kind and gentle with ourselves. And I think that awareness piece is really crucial. We're just starting to cultivate even a little awareness of when self-compassion could even be of benefit. So some of the, I'm pretty practical in many ways. So I do think it's helpful to offer some really practical tools for parents because you are talking about changing habit patterns, right? And they've been built into our neural pathways, and we're following the ones that are just most accessible. And so in making a change, we have to first see that before we can then choose a different pathway. And so it is a process, right? So we don't certainly want to be trying to be perfect about this, right? We talk about like in self-compassion, it's not about being perfect, right? We're perfectly imperfect. And so really important to not try to be perfect now at self-compassion. Like, let's not add that to the list of things we'll give ourselves a hard time about. And so I think to gently lean into it, and specifically, right, there's general self-compassion. Kind of in the book, we walk people through self-compassion for themselves, just generally, that works for sort of anybody. But then sort of self-compassion in terms of being a caregiver. How can you be self-compassionate to yourself in that role, which has lots of stress and difficulties? And so we talk a little bit about that. And then how do you model it for your children? And then how do you teach it, right? So there's all these layers. But I think at the very baseline, I loved that Kathryn started us with an intention. She reminded us before we started our interview about the intention, right? And I often start my morning with that reminder of my intention for my day, to be of benefit. And I think of intention as sort of a North Star. And so if sort of my directionality, and of course, the ship isn't always going straight towards it. We veer off course, and then we notice the tug, and we come back gently towards that North Star. So I think the first piece, and we do have 2 practices around intention in the book, but I think the first piece would just be to set an intention that I intend to integrate self-compassion more into my own life and to my family life, right? I intend to be a little more gentle and kind towards myself, either generally and also as a parent. Parenting, I say this all the time when I teach, parenting is hard. Teaching, also caregivers, right? Teaching, really hard and so important. So we need to start by being really kind and gentle to ourselves. So just setting that intention, I think, is a very important first step. And one of the things that Louise and I focus a lot on is, I don't know if you've ever heard the quote by Sharon Salzberg where she says, mindfulness isn't that difficult, it's the remembering. So putting up little things. So I actually have, and this one isn't even specific to self-compassion, but like I did look for the glimmers, make them glow, right? This was just one for, some of the work that I'm doing around happiness right now. But making like a little, kind of thing that you can put up, not just for kids, right? For us adults, it can be helpful. Kathryn mentioned having a sticky note, right? It can be helpful to have little reminders around your space of that intention. And then I find, particularly in the parenting realm, that we have this inclination, and you could probably check it out in your own life with people you love. If they're struggling, especially, we tend to lean in and contract. And so one of the practices that I encourage parents to work with, right? Because we lean in and contract because we love our children. Again, not to make it bad or wrong. We just want to be discerning, right? Not judging, but discerning. We're leaning in and contracting. What if we intentionally settle back and soften? So the encouragement, if your child is coming towards you with something they are struggling with, right? We may have an inclination to fix it, to do the sort of the helicopter parent thing, or the snowplow, getting in front of problems, pushing them away. Not to give ourselves a hard time. We start to notice, We set that intention, and then we can gently settle back and soften before we respond. I always say we have to take care of this nervous system first before we can take care of theirs, right? So supporting ourselves in that moment, because if our child is suffering, we are suffering, right? We are also struggling in some way. So really, really important to me that before you even dive into like the actual more integrated self-compassion practices, that we give that little bit of space for our own nervous system, let it settle just a little bit, right? Offering that to ourselves. And then from a parenting perspective, it can be as easy as, and I think I mentioned this earlier just in our conversation, of course, honey. One of my favorite practices for parents and for anybody. I always think of it that it sort of includes the entire self-compassion break right within this one little phrase. Of course, you're frustrated, honey, or of course you're worried about your child, honey, or of course, will relate to this one, probably everybody at some point. Of course, you're overwhelmed, honey, right? Of course. I'm in a couple preschools right now. It can be overwhelming. Of course, you're overwhelmed right now, honey. The honey is the self-kindness. The of course is the common humanity. Of course, it makes sense. Anyone in this circumstance would feel overwhelmed given the conditions, right? And then the naming of the feeling, mindfulness. So it kind of encapsulates it in this one nice, quick, easy phrase. And I do think it's helpful to kind of have some phrases that work for you. And I say honey as my term of endearment. Use whatever one works for you. Or to just say, just like everyone, sometimes I get frustrated. So just like everyone kind of practice. And you might notice I am consistently, and I do this all the time, putting my hand on my heart as I'm talking. I just saw myself in the video and I realized I was doing it. I do it so often I don't even realize. But this, we know, this kind, loving touch is really supportive of offering ourselves that inner kindness. There's physiological reasons why that's beneficial to us, but even just that knowing, I'm offering myself, of course, honey, offering myself a little tenderness and kindness. I remember when I was doing the mindful self-compassion training and they talked about this as a practice. I'm like, I've been doing I do that all the time. It just was something that intuitively I knew soothed my nervous system and also was the way I connected with people, especially when we are physically in the same space. So you might notice as people are talking, I kind of do this. So really helpful for parents to just something as simple as your child is having a tantrum, a little hand on the heart. Of course, this is hard, honey. Right. So giving yourself that self-care. And when you don't remember to do it, being kind to yourself about that too. Right. Because you won't remember. I still don't remember sometimes. Right. So really, really important not to, again, give ourselves a hard time about it. We've got conditioning for a whole variety of reasons to respond in certain ways. So say you yell at your child because something happened and that isn't how you choose to parent, right? And you've yelled at your child. Oh, everyone makes a mistake. It doesn't mean you don't apologize, right? If you've handled something in a way that you're not happy about. But first, be kind and gentle with yourself. And that will actually help you be able to apologize more authentically because you're able to kind of see it clearly and learn from it, less likely to do it again.
I mean, do you invite children to put their hand on their heart?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Probably the easiest access for little ones for self-compassion. So in my book, It's Okay, Being Kind to Yourself When Things Feel Hard, the phrase that's repeated in there is, I put my hand on my heart and here's what I say. It's okay. I love you. I'm with you today. And I can tell you that I did a program, I think it was last year, at our local library. And this parent came in and said, my daughter loves this book And she, in fact, goes around the neighborhood and is teaching everybody so it's this like little preschooler who's teaching the neighbors to put their hand on their heart. But what was the sweetest thing was in this program, so for kids, you want to add things to it, right? You want to make things as concrete. So this is really helpful. We make little heart stuffies. So we take good care of our hearts and we practice doing that. So we'd done a program in the library. We made our heart stuffy. I read the book. There's a song that Lindsay Storer, a woman in Australia, wrote and produced that's based on It's Okay. So we did the song. But afterwards, the parents were leaving and this child left with her mom. And somebody from the library came back in to talk to me. I was cleaning out my stuff. And she said, the little girl who just left here, there was a little boy out there who was crying. And she walked over to him and said, it's okay. Do you want to put your hand on your heart? And she said, here, practice with my heart stuffy, taking good care of your heart. And it was just, so not only can they learn it for themselves, but kids are willing to share those teachings and practices. So really, really powerful practice for children. And again, it's not like you do it once and now they're going to always put their hand on their heart. I think in Kathryn's question, right, it was like this comment about like we have to start, right? It's a practice. So we're rewiring our sort of usual ways of being. And so we need to practice. And same with children. So if they see you do it, if you want to teach these skills to children, right, they see you do it for yourself. And they also very much pick up on our voice, right? Our voice becomes their inner voice. And I know that can feel like a lot of pressure. And so again, that being kind and gentle with yourself around that. And it is really important to know like the tone we use, the way that we share these practices. If we can say to a child, oh, honey, that seems really hard, right? That can make a huge difference. And then say, you know what? Everyone feels bad about themselves sometimes. And putting our hand on our heart, or would you like a hug? Or do you want to sit with me for a minute? Sometimes I'll say to children, do you want to just sit with me for a minute while you have that feeling? Right? So to offer different options for that self-kindness. I once was reading It's Okay at a party, and there were only 2 children at this party, and it was supposed to be outside. It was inside. It was a small space. And so a challenging environment for kids. So I asked, there was a 4-year-old boy and his infant sister. And I said to him, do you want to read with me? So I happen to have It's Okay with me. So we sat down in the corner while all the adults are doing their adult thing. And he and I were reading the book. And afterwards, his little sister started crying. And I said, oh, it sounds like your little sister is feeling sad. And he said, yeah, everyone feels sad sometimes. One reading of that book, and he internalized that message, right? Like, will he remember it without repetition in the long run? Like, you need to repeat it. But that was, and I was a total stranger to him. One reading of the book, and he was already, and I heard him throughout the party. He had just moved, started a new school. I heard him repeat multiple times. Everyone gets nervous at a new school. Sometimes everyone, like he said it multiple times. So never underestimate the importance of sort of how we respond. If we model self-compassion, that is a really essential way for us to teach it, self-compassion to ourselves, but also responding to our children with that kind of compassionate voice using some of those tools.
What a wonderful exploration.
Wendy has such a beautiful way of making self-compassion feel both deeply meaningful and wonderfully practical.
I particularly loved her reminder that self-compassion isn't about lowering standards or letting ourselves off the hook. It's about giving ourselves the support we need to learn, grow, and keep going when life feels difficult.
In our next episode, The Conversation, Kathryn and I will be discussing some of the ideas that touched us most deeply, including self-compassion versus self-esteem, the messages children receive from the adults around them, and why kindness may be one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves and our children. We'd love you to join us.
And this is only part 1 of our conversation with Wendy.
Next week, Wendy returns as we explore parenting from fear versus love, practical ways to teach self-compassion, and how we can bring these skills into everyday family life.
Here's to raising kind minds,
starting with your own.